Some rooms, they don't need to scream to let you know they're dangerous. Voluto was one of them. The music never crept above a murmur. Chair legs didn't scrape. Nobody laughed loud enough to be heard at the next table. Between the dark wood paneling, the dim lighting, and those heavy blackout curtains swallowing the street view, the whole place was designed to protect something. And it sure as hell wasn't the pasta. 2 years I'd been working the floor, long enough to have the rules carved into my brain. Eyes forward. Walk soft. Hear nothing. Forget everything. It's the kind of joint that pays you to be a ghost in plain sight. Quick pause. If you're into stories where loyalty blurs the lines between worlds that were never meant to collide, hit subscribe. You aren't just watching this one. You're witnessing it. Usually, I was a great ghost. Just not tonight. He was already at table 9 when I clocked in. You don't even have to look at Stefano Caruso to know he's there. The temperature in the room just drops. He wasn't loud. He wasn't putting on a show. He just sat there in a dark suit, his back pinned to the wall, radiating that dead calm stillness of a guy who knows he's the most lethal thing breathing in a 50-mile radius. He had an audience, a walking brick wall to his left, and 2 guys across the table who had out-of-town muscle written all over them. Slap in the middle of the pristine white tablecloth sat a crisp, official-looking document. Caruso had a gold pen resting lightly in his right hand. I wasn't supposed to look at the paper. I wasn't supposed to look at anything. My job was idiot-proof. Drop off the second bottle of wine, so I make 0 noise doing it, and vanish. I crossed the floor, gripping the bottle perfectly, my soft-soled shoes barely making a whisper on the hardwood. Deadpan face, invisible. I was maybe 4 steps away when the letters at the top of that document caught my eye. The letterhead. 2 words I had burned into my memory 3 weeks ago, standing in my crappy kitchen at 11 at night. That was when my 17-year-old brother flashed a slick business card and swore he'd finally found real money. The kind that was going to pull our family out of the dirt once and for all. Meridian Holdings. Amazingly. My hands didn't shake. I kept walking. I set the bottle down with a soft, practiced clink. And then I leaned in, just close enough so only one man in that room could hear me, and let 4 words slip out of my mouth that I knew I could never, ever take back. Please, don't sign that. The room didn't blow up. It just stopped breathing altogether. And Stefano Caruso slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. I'm Thessaly Voss. In Bridgeport, a name like that doesn't open doors. Hell, it doesn't even bother knocking. Growing up on Delray Street, you learn how the world actually works pretty fast. You learn to sprint for the city bus even though it's never, ever on time. You learn that your mother's knees will give out way before her stubbornness does. And you learn that making $14 an hour at a place where a single glass of wine costs exactly that much isn't some cruel twist of irony. It's just Tuesday. Yeah, I was 26, and I owned exactly 1 good pair of work shoes. I kept them tied up in a plastic grocery bag under my bed to keep the dust off, because if they scuffed, I couldn't afford to replace them. That's the kind of tired we were living with. Not the kind 8 hours of sleep can fix. The kind that lives in your bones and follows you everywhere. My little brother, Prentice, was 17. He was smart, like genuinely brilliant. The kind of smart that deserved a hell of a lot better than Delray Street. But being smart doesn't make rent. It doesn't pay that stack of hospital bills I kept shoving to the back of the kitchen drawer because I couldn't stomach opening them. And it definitely doesn't stop a 17-year-old kid from looking up to the wrong kind of men when the good ones are nowhere to be found. And 3 weeks before that Thursday night at Voluto, Prentice walked through the front door looking different. A brand new phone, fresh kicks, a heavy new jacket, and that very specific, shifting way of looking everywhere except directly into my eyes. I backed him into the kitchen around 11 that night and told him I wasn't moving an inch until he leveled with me. He played dumb for a good 20 minutes before finally caving. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Meridian Holdings. Simple black text. No address. Just a phone number. He swore it was just logistics. Moving boxes around. Running deliveries. Said the pay was great and the hours were easy. When I asked who his boss was, he got defensive. Said he didn't know the whole setup yet. That he was just the new guy. I stood there looking at my brother. Looking at how proud he was. Like somebody had finally convinced him he actually mattered in this world. And I felt this sudden, freezing dread pool in my stomach. I didn't have a name for that feeling yet. I sure do now. Before that night, I only knew the name Caruso the way everyone else in Bridgeport did, as this massive, dark shadow moving quietly behind the scenes. It wasn't something you looked at directly. You just felt it. You felt it when the Southport freight lines mysteriously stayed open, while union strikes paralyzed the rest of the city. You felt it when some loudmouth city councilman pushing for port inspections suddenly shut up overnight. No press release. No explanation. You saw it in the construction bids. The way specific blocks got specific funding, and certain guys landed the cushy jobs, and nobody ever dared to ask who signed the checks. That was the Caruso name. It wasn't a family. It was a machine. Stefano's dad, Aldo, built the whole thing out of thin air. Started with a single shipping container, 3 guys who owed him blood, and the guts to cross lines that legitimate businessmen wouldn't touch. By the time a heart attack took Aldo out 6 years ago, that machine had its roots buried so deep in Bridgeport's concrete that ripping it out would have pulled the whole city down with it. Stefano inherited every last piece of it. But what I didn't get yet, what not a single soul at Veluto had bothered to warn me about, was how completely different Stefano was from the man who built the empire. Aldo had loved the spotlight, flashy gold rings, quite big public dinners that felt like theater, guys jumping to their feet the second he walked in. Stefano wasn't like that. He stuck to dark, tailored suits and spoke like a guy who had already calculated every single word you were about to say before you even opened your mouth. If you didn't know him, you'd probably guess he was in high-end real estate. If you did know him, you made damn sure you never had to hear his name twice. And I had just leaned in and whispered in his ear, right in front of 4 guys whose loyalty could be bought and sold, and told him to stop. I had no idea what a stunt like that was going to cost me, but looking into his eyes, I could tell he already knew exactly what the price was. The first thing that hit me was the noise. Or rather, the lack of it. The usual low hum of the dining room, the faint clink of silverware, the soft jazz bleeding through the ceiling speakers, the quiet murmur from the other tables. It all just started peeling away, piece by piece. It was like the room itself realized a line had just been crossed. The guy to Stefano's left was the first to react. His chair scraped backward exactly 1 inch, and his right hand dropped out of sight below the edge of the table. I didn't even bother tracking where his hand went. I already knew. Across the table, one of the out-of-town guys, Vasile's muscle, slowly set his wine glass down. He did it the way a guy does when he suddenly decides he needs both hands free. Nobody breathed a word. Stefano didn't flinch. He just sat there. He was staring right at me, but not with anger. Not with confusion either. And definitely not with that cold, razor-sharp edge you'd expect from a guy carrying his kind of weight on the streets. He looked at me the way you look at a puzzle you haven't quite figured out yet. Quiet. Perfectly still. Honestly, that was 10 times heavier than any explosion I'd braced myself for. I forced myself to stand up straight, gripping the wine bottle with both hands. I took a slow breath in through my nose, doing that exact same breathing trick I used to do to calm Prentice down when he was just a scared little kid looking for an anchor. 10 seconds ticked by, maybe 15. I lost count. Stefano finally laid the gold pen flat on the tablecloth. He didn't put the cap back on, and he didn't hand it over to anyone else. He just set it down, like the decision had already been finalized somewhere else entirely. Then he turned to the guys across the table and muttered something so low I couldn't catch it. Whatever it was, both of Vasile's guys leaned back in their chairs in perfect unison. The brick wall to his left, a guy named Renato, though I wouldn't learn that until later, leaned in close to Stefano's ear. I watched a muscle in Stefano's jaw feather just once. Then his eyes locked back onto mine. "Bring the check," he said. That was it. But Renato never took his eyes off my back as I turned and walked away. And in a joint like Voluto, a look that long from a guy like that was never just nothing. Listen, you need to understand something right out of the gate. My brother wasn't a bad kid. Prentice was the kind of 17-year-old who fixed things, busted appliances, shattered phone screens. That leaky pipe under our kitchen sink the landlord ignored for 3 months. Give him something broken, and he'd put it back together better than new. My mom always said he had an engineer's hands and a philosopher's heart, and she was dead right about both. What he didn't have was a way out. When you grow up on Delray Street, where the public schools are broke, the mentors never show up. And every real opportunity requires a last name you weren't born with. The streets stop looking like danger. They start looking like the only place offering anything real. The only room that lets you walk in without a referral. That's not stupidity. That's just what happens when every legit door stays locked for too long. I'd spent the last 3 weeks trying to pull him back from the edge. I tried everything, talking gently, laying down the law, or even crying, which I hated letting him see. I called our mom, which made me feel sick, because Dorinda Voss was already ill and carrying way more weight than her body could handle. Dropping Prentice's mess in her lap felt like putting a boulder on a chest that was already struggling to breathe. I even swallowed my pride and called our cousin down in Atlanta, begging her to let Prentice crash there for a while. She gave me a maybe, but maybe wasn't fast enough, because that Thursday night, while I was standing at table 9 holding a wine bottle and choking on 4 words I couldn't take back, my brother was sitting in a running car down by the South Port. He was waiting on orders he didn't fully understand, working for an outfit called Meridian Holdings. He had no clue that company's name was stamped at the top of the contract that almost got signed that night. He had no idea his big sister was the reason the ink never hit the paper. And I had absolutely no idea if what I'd just done had saved his life, or painted a massive target on both of our backs. Quick pause. The tension is ramping up, and loyalty is about to be put to the ultimate test. If you live for stories where people risk it all for love and survival across class lines, hit subscribe and ride this out with them. Nobody sitting at that table thought the night was going to end like this. Vasile Dumitru was the first to bail. He stood at the coat check, buttoning his jacket with the slow, deliberate movements of a guy desperately trying not to look pissed off. His 2 goons trailed right behind him, and one of them shot a single look back over his shoulder at the dining room, and then they vanished into the Bridgeport night. No handshakes, no signed papers, no deal. Back near the rear corridor, Renato cornered Stefano. I couldn't hear a word they were saying, and honestly, I wasn't even supposed to be looking. But I was standing there wiping down a service station that had already been clean for 10 minutes, watching their reflections play out in the dark, window glass across the floor. Renato was wound tight. His hands flew up twice as he talked. Stefano didn't move a muscle. Whatever Renato was spitting out, Stefano gave him a short answer. And whatever that answer was, it made Renato freeze up completely. The exact way massive, dangerous men freeze when they hear something they hate. but no they can't argue with. But Stefano walked back to the table by himself. He sat down, took a final sip of his water, and asked for the check. His voice was completely level, like he was just asking for the time. I grabbed the bill folder and dropped it on the table, making sure to keep my eyes glued to the tablecloth. He paid in cash, crisp, folded bills, exact change, no fumbling around. He was exactly the kind of guy who knew the price of everything before he even pulled up a chair. Then he stood up, slipped his coat on, and headed for the door. I was back at the service station trying to slow my heart rate when the maitre d' materialized right next to me. He held out a tiny folded slip of white paper. No envelope. From the gentleman at table 9, he muttered, already walking away before I could even open my mouth. So I waited until the room was busy, looking the other way before I unfolded it. An address. A time. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. No name attached. No explanation. It wasn't exactly a threat, but it sure as hell wasn't a promise of safety either. Just those two details, written out in the sharp, controlled handwriting of a man who calculates every single thing he puts on paper. I stood there, staring at the slip under the dim yellow service light, and I already knew I was going to show up. The address took me to a building I would have walked past 1,000 times without looking twice. 3 stories. Faded brick. A cheap brass plaque by the front door that read Harlan Import Group in dull, sensible lettering. It was exactly the kind of bland, generic front designed to answer your questions before you even thought to ask them. Sandwiched between a mom-and-pop florist and a dry cleaner. The whole block screamed, "Nothing to see here," which was exactly the point. I walked through the door at 9 o'clock, on the dot. A massive guy in a heavy dark coat just nodded me down a side hallway. He didn't search my bag. He didn't ask for my name. Hell, he didn't even make eye contact. That little detail told me everything I needed to know. He already knew exactly who I was, and he'd been told to expect me. Any sane person would have turned around right then. I kept walking. The upstairs room was small and uncomfortably clean. 1 table, 2 chairs. The window blinds were pulled down halfway. There was coffee on the table. 2 cups, both already poured and steaming. He had timed my arrival down to the exact second. Stefano was already sitting there. My invisible muscle this time. No Renato breathing down my neck. No out-of-town associates. Just him. He was wearing a sharp gray suit today, looking less like the untouchable ghost from Voluto, and more like a guy who'd been awake all night chewing on a problem he couldn't quite crack. He didn't say good morning. He didn't even offer me the empty chair. He just locked his eyes on mine and asked the only question that actually mattered. "What do you know about Meridian Holdings?" So, I told him. Not the whole sob story, obviously. Not the gut-wrenching fear. Not the 3 weeks of lying awake staring at the ceiling. And definitely not the way Prentice had looked standing in our crappy kitchen, swimming in borrowed confidence and brand new shoes. I just gave him the raw facts. My brother. The slick business card. Said the logistics gig he'd taken. The company name that perfectly matched the top of that document sitting on his table the night before. Stefano didn't interrupt me. Once. I honestly expected him to push back, to correct me, or at least say something to remind me of the massive, dangerous gap between his world and mine. Instead, he just sat there, dead still, letting every single word I said land exactly where it was supposed to. When I finally finished, he stared down at his black coffee for a long, quiet second. Then his eyes flicked back up to mine. "Is your brother still working for them?" "Yes," I said. He gave a single, slow nod, like my answer had just confirmed a very bad feeling he'd been carrying around for a while. And the temperature in that room instantly dropped 10 degrees. I had no idea there was a second meeting happening that exact same morning. While I was sitting across from Stefano in that suffocatingly quiet room above the flower shop. Renato Fecci was parked in a different room clear across town, digging up every single piece of dirt he could find on a nobody waitress named Thessaly Voss. He pulled my Voluto employment files. 2 years, clean record, 0 incidents. My crappy address on Delray Street. My mother, Dorinda, racking up bills getting treatment at Bridgeport General. And my little brother, 17, clean sheet, but newly tied to a crew of street-level runners moving freight down at the South Port. Tied to Meridian Holdings. I wouldn't find out about Renato's little deep dive until weeks later, and from a source I never saw coming. But the angle he played became obvious real quick. See, Renato didn't just hand Stefano a neutral background check. He weaponized it. He used Prentice as Exhibit A. He spun every detail he dug up to point at one glaring conclusion. The waitress was a plant, tied to Vasile's crew through her idiot brother, and deliberately sent in to blow up the deal. It was a clean, logical narrative, and it was perfectly engineered to force Stefano's hand. But Renato miscalculated one thing: Stefano's reaction. Stefano gave him absolutely nothing. No nod of agreement, no pushback. Just dead. Heavy silence. The exact kind of silence that Renato, after years of standing at the man's right shoulder, really should have recognized as lethal. That night, my phone rang. Unknown caller ID. I only answered it because Prentice had ignored my last 2 calls, when my chest was already tight with that suffocating dread you only get when someone you love is out there in the dark and you can't reach them. I picked up, but nobody spoke. The line was just open. I could hear faint background noise, the hollow echo of a room somewhere, people moving around. Then dead silence. Then a click. I stood frozen in my kitchen, clutching the phone long after the screen faded to black. I tried to lie to myself. I told myself it was nothing, just a misdial, a glitch in the network. But you don't grow up on Delray Street without learning how to read between the lines. I knew the specific, heavy weight of a silence that carries a message nobody wants to say out loud. Someone was just checking to see if I was home to answer. My mom never asked for a damn thing. Honestly, that was always the hardest part. Dorinda Voss spent 30 solid years shrinking herself down just so the rest of us had room to breathe. Room to grow up, to screw up, to make messes that she'd quietly sweep under the rug without ever once complaining about being tired. She never sat around waiting to be rescued. She just kept showing up. For me, for Prentice, for whatever patched-together version of normal we were trying to build on Delray Street. So when I pushed open her hospital room door that Friday afternoon and found her sitting up in bed, watching the local news with her reading glasses shoved up into her hair, I smiled. It was the exact same smile I'd been practicing in the mirror since I was 19. The one perfectly engineered to say, "Everything is completely fine, Mama." She saw right through it. She always did. She reached out and grabbed my hand, on just holding it in silence for a long beat. Then she brought up Prentice. She did it casually, using that specific, offhand tone mothers use when they are absolutely terrified about something. One of the neighbors had been talking, whispers in our building about the kind of crowd he'd been running with lately. I lied right to her face. I told her he was doing great, just tied up with a new job. She gave me this slow, measured nod, the kind of nod she used when she was filing a piece of information away to interrogate me about later. We steered clear of it after that, talked about her upcoming follow-up procedure instead, gossiped about which nurses she liked and which ones had an attitude, joked about that daytime soap she'd already binged twice. I stayed for 2 hours. I held her hand. I made sure to laugh at all the right cues. But walking out through the main lobby, I walked right past a guy in a heavy dark jacket sitting near the sliding doors. He had a newspaper folded in his lap and never bothered looking up. But I didn't need him to. I'd seen that exact same jacket standing outside Voluto 2 nights ago. I didn't break my stride. I kept walking right through the automatic doors and out into the biting cold. My hands were completely steady. The rest of me was falling apart. Quick pause. This is the part where most people check out. But you're still here. That tells me you're actually here for the depth, not just cheap surface-level drama. Hit subscribe and commit to stories that don't take shortcuts. Here's the part of the story I was completely blind to for a long time. While I was rattling home on the city bus from the hospital, and getting nothing but useless, "I'm good" texts from Prentice. A guy named Vasile Dumitru was holed up in a warehouse office down by the South Port. He was drinking black coffee and staring at a photograph. A photograph of me. Someone had snapped it outside Voluto 2 nights before the dinner. I was just showing up for my shift, work bag slung over my shoulder, practically sprinting because the bus was late, and my manager was already breathing down my neck about punctuality. In the picture, I looked exactly like what I was, a girl who had somewhere to be and not nearly enough time to get there. Vasile had been staring at that picture for 10 straight minutes. I had to untangle this whole mess much later, but the short version is this. Vasile Dumitru didn't just wander into Bridgeport by accident. He was invited. Quietly. And that invitation didn't come from Romania. It came straight from the inside of the Caruso machine. Somebody had left the back door wide open. Somebody tipped Vasile off that the territory was softer than it looked, that the guy running the show was distracted, and that sinking the right deal at the right time would plant roots no one could ever rip out. Vasile didn't come to Bridgeport to compete with Stefano Caruso. He came because someone convinced him Stefano was already bleeding out. And that unsigned contract at Voluto was supposed to be the kill shot of a plan 2 years in the making. The only thing they didn't factor in was a nobody waitress from Delray Street who happened to recognize a company letterhead. The crazy thing? Vasile wasn't even pissed about the disruption. He was just curious. But it was that specific, a hyper-focused, dead quiet curiosity that only genuinely lethal men possess. He wanted to know who the hell I was, not to punish me, at least not yet. He wanted to know what I knew, how I knew it, and whether I could be played. By then, his guys had already tracked down Prentice. They didn't threaten him. That part came later. First, they pulled a much smarter move. They offered my baby brother a promotion. More cash, a bigger role. They handed him a shiny new reason to feel like he was finally moving up in the world, right at the exact second I was desperately trying to drag him back down to earth. Prentice took the bait before the sun even set. He shot me a text later that night. 4 casual, breezy words. I got a raise. I sat alone in my pitch-black apartment, staring at the glowing screen. I'm feeling the walls of something massive and invisible closing in on us. And then, Stefano's number lit up my screen. Stefano didn't ask if I wanted to pack up my life. He just told me it was happening. It wasn't rough. He didn't threaten me. He just delivered the news the exact same way a guy tells you it's going to rain. Just a hard, settled fact you had to deal with. A new spot. Somewhere off the radar. He had already arranged to transfer my mom to a better facility, fully paid for and closer to us. And if we moved fast enough, Prentice might actually get some breathing room. I asked him what the hell I was supposed to tell my sick mother about why we were fleeing our apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. He just said, "Sure, tell her whatever keeps her calm." That was the exact moment I figured out a truth about Stefano Caruso that his terrifying street rep completely missed. He wasn't cruel. He just lived in a world where human emotions were math problems, not stop signs. You factored them in, you managed them, and you kept moving. I didn't fight him on it. I packed a single duffel bag. I helped my mom down the stairs and into a black sedan that was already idling at the curb. I didn't bother asking who owned it. What I didn't know was the hell that decision was unleashing on his end. Renato found out within hours. Honestly, I'd stopped being surprised by what that guy knew and how fast he knew it. He marched straight to Stefano, and for the first time in all the years those two had run the city together, it wasn't a status report. It was a straight-up confrontation. Renato called me a massive liability. He flat out said that protecting some random waitress whose brother was tangled up with a rival crew wasn't a strategy. It was a glaring vulnerability. He warned Stefano that Vasile's guys were watching their every move, and hiding me just drew a giant red bullseye right over Stefano's only weakness. Stefano let him get it all out. Then he shut the whole thing down with 3 words. She stays safe. No explaining himself, no room for debate. Renato turned around and walked out without another word. That should have felt like a win, but it didn't. It felt like a heavy iron door slamming shut between the two of them for the very first time. Later that night, I lay awake in a sterile hotel room I didn't choose, just listening to the steady rhythm of my mother breathing in the bed next to mine. She was safe. She was alive. We were here. But somewhere across Bridgeport, sitting in a dark car parked outside a building I'd never see, Renato pulled out his phone and made a call. And he wasn't dialing Vasile. He showed up at the hotel on the 3rd night. Late. He didn't even knock at first, just sent a quick text saying he was standing in the hall and that I didn't have to open the door. I opened it anyway. My mom was dead to the world. The room was mostly dark. He was standing in the doorway in that heavy dark coat, the city skyline glowing faintly behind him. For just a split second, he didn't look like the most lethal guy in Bridgeport. He just looked like a man who'd been carrying a crushing weight for way too long and couldn't find a place to set it down. I stepped back and let him in. We sat across from each other at the cheap little table by the window. He didn't even take off his coat. I finally asked him the question that had been burning a hole in my chest since that night at Voluto. Why did you stop? You didn't do it for me. You don't even know me. So, why? He just stared at the table for a long time. He wasn't dodging the question. He was working his way up to it, like a guy circling a fire he hasn't been close to in years. Then, he told me about Marco, his little brother. 4 years younger, sharp, funny, the kind of kid who just made a room feel warmer the second he walked into it. Stefano described him so carefully. It wasn't exactly grief in his voice. It was that surgical precision you get when you've memorized every single detail of a person you know you're never going to see again. 6 years ago, Marco got pulled into something bad. Not the family business, but something adjacent to it. A crew moving through the same shadows, just outside of Stefano's reach. By the time Stefano put the pieces together, the window to yank his brother out had already slammed shut. Marco died 3 weeks after their dad, Aldo. The cops called it an accident. Stefano never called it that. Not to the police. Not out loud. Not even in the darkest, quietest corners of his own mind. When he finished the story, he finally looked up at me. You walked right up to that table knowing exactly what it could cost you, he said softly. I had that exact same choice 6 years ago, and I chose the Empire. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. I just wanted to see what it looked like when someone chose differently. The room got so quiet I could hear the faint hum of traffic 12 floors down. I just sat there, letting the sheer weight of what he'd just handed me sink in. This untouchable kingpin had just handed his deepest, darkest regret to a waitress he'd known for less than 2 weeks. But there was one piece left. I took a breath and asked the question that had been gnawing at the back of my brain since the second I recognized that company letterhead. Did you know Meridian Holdings was connected to the people who killed your brother? The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the longest, heaviest silence of my entire life. And when he finally answered, just one single word, barely more than an exhale, Everything clicked. This was never about a business deal. It was never about the contract at all. The truth about Renato Feci didn't hit me all at once like some grand revelation. It crept in like a door, slowly swinging open in a pitch-black room. Just one agonizing inch at a time, until the light spilling through from the other side made everything you thought you knew look completely unrecognizable. Stefano was the one who laid it out for me. It was a Thursday morning, 4 days after he bared his soul at that tiny hotel table. He sat across from me, hands planted flat on the wood between us, and walked me through the whole ugly mess. He sounded like a guy who had forced himself to verify the intel 3 separate times before he actually let himself believe it. And Renato was the one who built the pipeline for Vasile. And he didn't just do it last week. He started 2 years ago. He did it quietly, methodically, burying the connections under layers of shady introductions and rerouted freight shipments that just looked like standard business from the outside. Renato had personally unlocked Bridgeport's back door for a Romanian operator hungry for the Southport. And he didn't do it just because Vasile was throwing cash at him, though I'm sure that didn't hurt. He did it because he'd spent 2 years watching Stefano run the Caruso empire differently than Aldo had. Quieter, tighter, leaving zero room for the guys underneath to breathe, expand, or take what Renato genuinely believed he was owed. Renato wasn't trying to burn the empire down. He was setting himself up to inherit it. The setup was terrifyingly clean. Vasile gets a protected foothold through the Veluto contract. Vasile's crew, technically operating under the Caruso umbrella, hands Renato massive leverage over both sides. And eventually, when Stefano, isolated, heavily managed, and completely outmaneuvered from the inside, becomes a liability to his own machine, Renato just steps in, naturally, loyally, the faithful right hand stepping up to save the day. Every single piece of advice Renato had whispered in Stefano's ear for the last 2 years was pure manipulation. Every concern he faked, every name he threw under the bus, every single time he played the voice of reason, it was all just the slow, invisible construction of a trap. And Prentice? My baby brother wasn't just some random accident caught in the crossfire. He was a tool, a calculated pressure point, a heavy leash to control a nobody waitress who had stumbled into the absolute center of everything, and somehow refused to just lay down and die. Renato had known about Prentice's ties to Meridian Holdings way before that Thursday night at Veluto. He knew, and he kept his mouth shut. Because a terrified, exposed girl trying to keep her little brother alive is a hell of a lot easier to manage than a loose end. Stefano finally stopped talking. I just sat there, letting the sheer sickness of it wash over me. 2 entire years. The careful, patient positioning, building a cage around a man using the very guy he trusted most in the world. Then, my brain snapped straight to Prentice, sitting in some running car down at the Southport, totally blind to the fact that he was just a pawn in a mob war. And I looked Stefano dead in the eye and asked, "Where is my brother right now?" Stefano's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why I'm here. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. He did not take me with him. He ordered me to stay locked in the hotel, keep my mom calm, and ignore any knock on the door unless I got a text first. He didn't say it with any of that dramatic, cinematic urgency that makes a situation feel like an action movie. He just stated it, like a guy who knew their margin for error had just dropped to absolute zero. So, I stayed. For exactly 40 minutes. Then I called a cab and handed the driver a Southport address. I'd pieced it together from a slip-up Prentice made 3 weeks ago, back when he was still trying to sell me on the idea that this was just a normal logistics job. And I had memorized that address the same way I memorized everything that terrified me. Carefully, completely, and just in case. Down by the warehouses at 4 in the morning, the dark hit's different. It's not totally dead. There's always action near the port, trucks rumbling, guys working the graveyard shift. But the shadows between the streetlights feel thicker down there, heavier. It's the kind of pitch black that only exists because somebody decided they needed it to hide things. I didn't go charging inside. I pressed my back against a cold, concrete barrier across the street and just watched. Honestly, the most shocking part was the lack of violence. Stefano didn't kick the door in like some mobster in a Hollywood flick. No screaming matches echoing across the asphalt. So I found out later he'd made exactly 3 phone calls from his car before he even stepped out. 2 to guys who owed him favors, and 1 to a dock boss who owed him his life. By the time Stefano strolled up to that building, the guys inside who were supposed to be loyal to Renato's little coup had already gotten a very clear message from a much higher power. 22 minutes after I got there, Prentice stumbled out of a side door. He looked so much smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just completely stripped of that fake, bulletproof confidence he'd been parading around in. He was still wearing that expensive new jacket from when he thought he'd finally hit the jackpot. He spotted me standing across the street. He froze for a second. Then he slowly walked over, and I threw my arms around my baby brother right there in a parking lot reeking of salt water and diesel fumes. I held on way longer than I probably needed to. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he just mumbled into my shoulder. I didn't know it was this bad. I know, I whispered back. Behind him, across the empty lot, a heavy door clicked shut. And somewhere deep in that city, the massive machine that had been running on pure betrayal for 2 solid years finally got its power cut. 10 days later, Bridgeport was exactly what it had always been. The city buses still ran 20 minutes behind schedule. The river still looked dark and freezing under that bleak November sky. The South Port kept moving heavy freight all through the night, and the guys deciding which shipping containers went where were still sitting down to quiet dinners in heavily guarded restaurants. Some things don't change just because one contract didn't get signed. But some things do. Prentice caught a train down to Atlanta on a Tuesday morning. I drove him to the station myself. He only brought 1 bag, not the shiny new one, but his beat-up old duffel with the busted zipper he'd been swearing to fix for 2 years. He left that expensive new jacket hanging in the hotel closet. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. Standing on the platform, he turned to me. He had this specific, heavy look on his face, the look of a 17-year-old kid who's just seen the real world up close, and is smart enough to realize he can't fully process it yet. "I'm gonna pay you back," he muttered. "All of it. Every dime." I just told him to make sure he picked up his damn phone when I called. He almost smiled. Then he turned around and got on the train. My mom's surgery went smoothly. Her doctor tossed around words like promising and manageable. That careful doctor speak that isn't exactly a guarantee, but it's close enough to let you breathe again. She never brought up Prentice, or the hotel, or those 2 chaotic weeks where our entire lives were uprooted without her permission. When I visited, she just held my hand, watched her daytime TV, and told me I looked tired. She wasn't wrong. Stefano tracked me down one last time. Not at the hotel. I was already long gone by then. We met on a bridge over the river. It was mid-morning. The sky was a flat gray, and it was cold enough that we both had our collars popped and coats buttoned all the way up. But he looked like his usual self, sharp, controlled, completely present. But the way he stood was different. He wasn't putting on a show anymore. He wasn't bracing himself for an audience that wasn't there. He asked me what my next move was. I told him the truth. I didn't know yet. But for the first time in years, I actually had a little bit of breathing room to figure it out. He nodded slowly, staring out over the freezing water. "Renato is handled," he said quietly. "Vasile and I renegotiated. Different terms, different arrangement. It's cleaner." I asked him if that meant the war was over. He stayed quiet for a long beat. It just means the next part starts differently. We stood there together for a little while longer without saying a word. Just two people standing on a bridge, trapped between two sides of a city that was never supposed to let us cross paths. When I finally turned and walked away, I left my one good pair of work shoes unwrapped under my bed for the very first time in years. Not because I'd stopped being careful, but because, finally, I felt like I was actually walking toward something. And for now, that was enough. Outro. Loyalty isn't proven when things are easy. It's proven when things fall apart. If this story earned your respect, hit that subscribe button. We build stories here that don't take shortcuts, don't cut corners, and don't leave you empty. You stuck around until the very end, and that means something. Subscribe now, and let's keep building something consistent together.